A Martian Odyssey by Stanley Weinbaum. Jarvis stretched himself as luxuriously as he could in the cramped general quarters of the Ares. "Air you can breathe," he exulted. "It feels as thick as soup after the thin stuff out there." He nodded at the Martian landscape stretching flat and desolate in the light of the nearer moon, beyond the glass of the port. The other three stared at him sympathetically. Putz, the engineer, Leroy, the biologist, and Harrison, the astronomer and captain of the expedition. Dick Jarvis was chemist of the famous crew, the Ares expedition, first human beings to set foot on the mysterious neighbor of the Earth, the planet Mars. This, of course, was in the old days, less than 20 years after the mad American Doheny perfected the atomic blast at the cost of his life, and only a decade after the equally mad Cardoza rode on it to the moon. They were true pioneers, these four of the Ares. Except for a half-dozen moon expeditions and the ill-fated Delancey flight aimed at the seductive orb of Venus, they were the first men to feel other gravity than Earth's, and certainly the first successful crew to leave the Earth-Moon system. And they deserved that success when one considers the difficulties and discomforts, the months spent in acclimatization chambers back on Earth, learning to breathe the air as tenuous as that of Mars, the challenging of the void in the tiny rocket driven by the cranky reaction motors of the 21st century, and mostly the facing of an absolutely unknown world. Jarvis stretched and fingered the raw and peeling tip of his frostbitten nose. He sighed again contentedly. "Well," exploded Harrison abruptly, "are we going to hear what happened? You set out all shipshape in an auxiliary rocket, we don't get a peep for 10 days, and finally Putz here picks you out of a lunatic ant heap with a freak ostrich as your pal. Spill it, man." "Spiel?" queried Leroy perplexedly. "Spiel what?" "He means spiel," explained Putz soberly. "It is to tell." Jarvis met Harrison's amused glance without the shadow of a smile. "That's right, Carl," he said in grave agreement with Putz. "Ich spiel es." He grunted comfortably and began. "According to orders," he said. "I watched Carl here take off toward the north, and then I got into my flying sweatbox and headed south. You'll remember, Cap. We had orders not to land, but just scout about for points of interest. I set the two cameras clicking and buzzed along, riding pretty high, about 2,000 feet, for a couple of reasons. First, it gave the cameras a greater field, and second, the underjets travel so far in this half-vacuum they call air here that they stir up dust if you move low. "We know all that from Putz," grunted Harrison. "I wish you'd saved the films, though. They'd have paid the cost of this junket. Remember how the public mobbed the first moon pictures?" "The films are safe," retorted Jarvis. "Well," he resumed, "as I said, I buzzed along at a pretty good clip. Just as we figured, the wings haven't much lift in this air at less than 100 miles per hour, and even then, I had to use the underjets. So, with the speed and the altitude and the blurring caused by the underjets, the seeing wasn't any too good. I could see enough, though, to distinguish that what I sailed over was just more of this gray plain that we'd been examining the whole week since our landing. Same blobby growths, and the same eternal carpet of crawling little plant animals, or biopods, as Leroy calls them. So I sailed along, calling back my position every hour as instructed, and not knowing whether you heard me." "I did!" snapped Harrison. 150 miles south," continued Jarvis imperturbably. "The surface changed to a sort of low plateau, nothing but desert and orange-tinted sand. I figured that we were right in our guess then, and this gray plain we dropped on was really the Mare Cimmerium, which would make my orange desert the region called Xanthus. If I were right, I ought to hit another gray plain, the Mare Cronium, in another couple of 100 miles, and then another orange desert, Thiel, or 2, and so I did." "Putz verified our position a week and a half ago," grumbled the captain. "Let's get to the point." "Coming," remarked Jarvis. 20 miles into Thiel. Believe it or not, I crossed a canal." Putz photographed 100. "Let's hear something new." "And did he also see a city?" 20 of them, if you call those heaps of mud cities." "Well," observed Jarvis, "from here on I'll be telling a few things Putz didn't see." He rubbed his tingling nose and continued. "I knew that I had 16 hours of daylight at this season, so 8 hours, 800 miles, from here, I decided to turn back. I was still over Thiel, whether I or two I'm not sure, not more than 25 miles into it. And right there, Putz's pet motor quit. Quit? How? Putz was solicitous. The atomic blast got weak. I started losing altitude right away, and suddenly there I was with a thump right in the middle of Thyle. Smashed my nose on the window, too. He rubbed the injured member ruefully. Did you maybe try vashing der combustion chamber mit acid sulfuric? Inquired Putz. Sometimes der lead gives a secondary radiation. Naw, said Jarvis disgustedly. I wouldn't try that, of course. Not more than 10 times. Besides, the bump flattened the landing gear and busted off the underjets. Suppose I got the thing working. What then? 10 miles with the blast coming right out of the bottom, and I'd have melted the floor from under me. He rubbed his nose again. Lucky for me, a pound only weighs 7 ounces here, or I'd have been mashed flat. I could have fixed, ejaculated the engineer. I bet it was not serious. Probably not, agreed Jarvis sarcastically. Only it wouldn't fly. Nothing serious, but I had my choice of waiting to be picked up or trying to walk back. 800 miles, and perhaps 20 days before we had to leave. 40 miles a day. Well, he concluded, I chose to walk. Just as much chance of being picked up, and it kept me busy. We'd have found you, said Harrison. No doubt. Anyway, I rigged up a harness from some seat straps and put the water tank on my back, took a cartridge belt and revolver, and some iron rations, and started out. Water tank! Exclaimed the little biologist Leroy. She weigh 1/4 ton. Wasn't full. Weighed about 250 pounds earth weight, which is 85 here. Then besides, my own personal 210 pounds is only 70 on Mars. So tank and all, I grossed 155 or 55 pounds less than my everyday earth weight. I figured on that when I undertook the 40-mile daily stroll. Oh, of course I took a thermoskin sleeping bag for these wintry Martian nights. Off I went, bouncing along pretty quickly. 8 hours of daylight meant 20 miles or more. It got tiresome, of course. Plugging along over a soft sand desert with nothing to see, not even Leroy's crawling biopods. But an hour or so brought me to the canal. Just a dry ditch about 400 feet wide, and straight as a railroad on its own company map. There'd been water in it sometime, though. The ditch was covered with what looked like a nice green lawn. Only, as I approached, the lawn moved out of my way. Eh? Said Leroy. Yeah, it was a relative of your biopods. I caught one, a little grass-like blade about as long as my finger with 2 thin, stemmy legs. He is where? Leroy was eager. He is let go. I had to move, so I plowed along with the walking grass opening in front and closing behind. And then I was out on the orange desert of Thyle again. I plugged steadily along, cussing the sand that made going so tiresome, and, incidentally, cussing that cranky motor of yours, Carl. It was just before twilight that I reached the edge of Thyle, and looked down over the gray mare Cronium. And I knew there was 75 miles of that to be walked over, and then a couple of 100 miles of that Xanthus desert, and about as much more mare Cimmerium. Was I pleased? I started cussing you fellows for not picking me up. We were trying, you sap, said Harrison. That didn't help. Well, I figured I might as well use what was left of daylight in getting down the cliff that bounded Thyle. I found an easy place, and down I went. Mare Cronium was just the same sort of place as this. Crazy leafless plants and a bunch of crawlers. I gave it a glance and hauled out my sleeping bag. Up to that time, you know, I hadn't seen anything worth worrying about on this half-dead world. Nothing dangerous, that is. Did you? Queried Harrison. Did I? You'll hear about it when I come to it. Well, I was just about to turn in when suddenly I heard the wildest sort of shenanigans. Vote is shenanigans? Inquired Putz. He says, Je ne sais quoi, explained Leroy. It is to say, I don't know what. That's right, agreed Jarvis. I didn't know what, so I sneaked over to find out. There was a racket like a flock of crows eating a bunch of canaries. Whistles, cackles, caws, trills, and what have you. I rounded a clump of stumps, and there was Tweel. Tweel? Said Harrison. And Taveel, said Leroy and Putz. That freak ostrich, explained the narrator. At least, Tweel is as near as I can pronounce it without sputtering. He called it something like Turwerl. What was he doing? Asked the captain. He was being eaten, and squealing, of course, as anyone would. Eaten, By what? I found out later. All I could see then was a bunch of black, ropey arms tangled around what looked like, as Putz described it to you, an ostrich. I wasn't going to interfere naturally. If both creatures were dangerous, I'd have one less to worry about. But the bird-like thing was putting up a good battle, dealing vicious blows with an 18-inch beak between screeches. And besides, I caught a glimpse or two of what was on the end of those arms. Jarvis shuddered. But the clincher was when I noticed a little black bag or case hung about the neck of the bird thing. It was intelligent. That or tame, I assumed. Anyway, it clinched my decision. I pulled out my automatic and fired into what I could see of its antagonist. There was a flurry of tentacles and a spurt of black corruption. And then the thing, with a disgusting sucking noise, pulled itself and its arms into a hole in the ground. The other let out a series of clacks, staggered around on legs about as thick as golf sticks, and turned suddenly to face me. I held my weapon ready, and the two of us stared at each other. The Martian wasn't a bird, really. It wasn't even bird-like, except just at first glance. It had a beak, all right, and a few feathery appendages, but the beak wasn't really a beak. It was somewhat flexible. I could see the tip bend slowly from side to side. It was almost like a cross between a beak and a trunk. It had 4-toed feet and 4-fingered things, hands you'd have to call them, and a little roundish body, and a long neck ending in a tiny head. And that beak. It stood an inch or so taller than I, and... Well, Putz saw it. The engineer nodded. Yeah, I saw, Jarvis continued. So, we stared at each other. Finally, the creature went into a series of clackings and twitterings, and held out its hands toward me, empty. I took that as a gesture of friendship. Perhaps, suggested Harrison, it looked at that nose of yours and thought you were its brother. Huh, you can be funny without talking. Anyway, I put up my gun and said, don't mention it, or something of the sort. And the thing came over, and we were pals. By that time, the sun was pretty low, and I knew that I'd better build a fire or get into my thermoskin. I decided on the fire. I picked a spot at the base of the Thiel cliff, where the rock could reflect a little heat on my back. I started breaking off chunks of this desiccated Martian vegetation, and my companion caught the idea and brought in an armful. I reached for a match, but the Martian fished into his pouch and brought out something that looked like a glowing coal. One touch of it, and the fire was blazing. And you all know what a job we have starting a fire in this atmosphere. And that bag of his, continued the narrator. That was a manufactured article, my friends. Press an end and she popped open. Press the middle and she sealed so perfectly you couldn't see the line. Better than zippers. Well, we stared at the fire a while and I decided to attempt some sort of communication with the Martian. I pointed at myself and said Dick. He caught the drift immediately, stretched a bony claw at me and repeated, Tick. Then I pointed at him, and he gave that whistle I called tweel. I can't imitate his accent. Things were going smoothly. To emphasize the names, I repeated Dick, and then pointing at him, tweel. There we stuck. He gave some clacks that sounded negative and said something like p-p-p-proot. And that was just the beginning. I was always Tick, but as for him, part of the time he was tweel, and part of the time he was p-p-proot. And part of the time he was 16 other noises. We just couldn't connect. I tried rock, and I tried star, and tree, and fire, and Lord knows what else, and try as I would, I couldn't get a single word. Nothing was the same for 2 successive minutes, and if that's a language, I'm an alchemist. Finally, I gave it up and called him Tweel, and that seemed to do. But Tweel hung on to some of my words. He remembered a couple of them, which I suppose is a great achievement if you're used to a language you have to make up as you go along. But I couldn't get the hang of his talk. Either I missed some subtle point or we just didn't think alike. And I rather believe the latter view. I've other reasons for believing that. After a while, I gave up the language business and tried mathematics. I scratched 2 + 2 = 4 on the ground and demonstrated it with pebbles. Again, Tweel caught the idea and informed me that 3 + 3 = 6. Once more, we seemed to be getting somewhere. So, knowing that Tweel had at least a grammar school education, I drew a circle for the sun, pointing first at it and then at the last glow of the sun. Then I sketched in Mercury and Venus and Mother Earth and Mars And finally, pointing to Mars, I swept my hand around in a sort of inclusive gesture to indicate that Mars was our current environment. I was working up to putting over the idea that my home was on the Earth. Tweel understood my diagram all right. He poked his beak at it, and with a great deal of trilling and clucking, he added Deimos and Phobos to Mars, and then sketched in the Earth's moon. Do you see what that proves? It proves that Tweel's race uses telescopes, that they're civilized. Does not, snapped Harrison. The moon is visible from here as a 5th magnitude star. They could see its revolution with the naked eye. The moon, yes, said Jarvis. You've missed my point. Mercury isn't visible, and Tweel knew of Mercury because he placed the moon at the 3rd planet, not the 2nd. If he didn't know Mercury, he'd put the Earth 2nd and Mars 3rd instead of 4th. See? Humph, said Harrison. Anyway, proceeded Jarvis, I went on with my lesson. Things were going smoothly, and it looked as if I could put the idea over. I pointed at the Earth on my diagram, and then at myself, and then, to clinch it, I pointed to myself, and then to the Earth itself, shining bright green almost at the zenith. Tweel set up such an excited clacking that I was certain he understood. He jumped up and down, and suddenly he pointed at himself and then at the sky, and then at himself and at the sky again. He pointed at his middle and then at Arcturus, at his head, and then at Spica, at his feet and then at 6 stars, while I just gaped at him. Then all of a sudden, he gave a tremendous leap. Man, what a hop. He shot straight up into the starlight, 75 feet if an inch. I saw him silhouetted against the sky, saw him turn and come down at me head first and land smack on his beak like a javelin. There he stuck square in the center of my sun circle in the sand, a bull's eye. Nuts, observed the captain. Plain nuts. That's what I thought too. I just stared at him open-mouthed while he pulled his head out of the sand and stood up. Then I figured he'd missed my point, and I went through the whole blamed rigmarole again, and it ended the same way, with Tweel on his nose in the middle of my picture. Maybe it's a religious rite, suggested Harrison. Maybe, said Jarvis dubiously. Well, there we were. We could exchange ideas up to a certain point, and then, bluey. Something in us was different, unrelated. I don't doubt that Tweel thought me just as screwy as I thought him. Our minds simply looked at the world from different viewpoints, and perhaps his viewpoint is as true as ours. But we couldn't get together, that's all. Yet, in spite of all difficulties, I liked Tweel, and I have a queer certainty that he liked me. Nuts, repeated the captain. Just daffy. Yeah? Wait and see. A couple of times I've thought that perhaps we... He paused, and then resumed his narrative. Anyway, I finally gave it up, and got into my thermoskin to sleep. The fire hadn't kept me any too warm, but that damned sleeping bag did. Got stuffy 5 minutes after I closed myself in. I opened it a little, and bingo! Some 80 below zero air hit my nose, and that's when I got this pleasant little frostbite to add to the bump I acquired during the crash of my rocket. I don't know what Tweel made of my sleeping. He sat around, but when I woke up, he was gone. I just crawled out of my bag, though, when I heard some twittering, and there he came, sailing down from that 3-story thial cliff to alight on his beak beside me. I pointed to myself and toward the north, and he pointed at himself and toward the south. But when I loaded up and started away, he came along. Man, how he traveled. 150 feet at a jump, sailing through the air stretched out like a spear and landing on his beak. He seemed surprised at my plodding, but after a few moments he fell in beside me. Only every few minutes he'd go into one of his leaps and stick his nose into the sand a block ahead of me. Then he'd come shooting back at me. It made me nervous at first to see that beak of his coming at me like a spear. But he always ended in the sand at my side. So the two of us plugged along across the Mare Cronium. Same sort of place as this. Same crazy plants and same little green biopods growing in the sand or crawling out of your way. We talked. Not that we understood each other, you know, but just for company. I sang songs, and I suspect Tweel did too. At least, some of his trillings and twitterings had a subtle sort of rhythm. Then, for variety, Tweel would display his smattering of English words. He'd point to an outcropping and say rock, and point to a pebble and say it again. or he'd touch my arm and say tick, and then repeat it. He seemed terrifically amused that the same word meant the same thing twice in succession, or that the same word could apply to two different objects. It set me wondering if perhaps his language wasn't like the primitive speech of some Earth people, you know, Captain, like the Negritos, for instance, who haven't any generic words. No word for food or water or man, words for good food and bad food, or rainwater and seawater, or strong man and weak man, but no names for general classes. They're too primitive to understand that rainwater and seawater are just different aspects of the same thing. But that wasn't the case with Tweel. It was just that we were somehow mysteriously different. Our minds were alien to each other. And yet, we liked each other. "Looney, that's all," remarked Harrison. "That's why you two were so fond of each other." "Well, I like you," countered Jarvis wickedly. "Anyway," he resumed, "don't get the idea that there was anything screwy about Tweel. In fact, I'm not so sure but that he couldn't teach our highly praised human intelligence a trick or two. Oh, he wasn't an intellectual superman, I guess. But don't overlook the point that he managed to understand a little of my mental workings, and I never even got a glimmering of his." "Because he didn't have any," suggested the captain, while Putz and Leroy blinked attentively. "You can judge of that when I'm through," said Jarvis. "Well, we plugged along across the Mare Cronium all that day, and all the next. Mare Cronium, Sea of Time. Say, I was willing to agree with Schiaparelli's name by the end of that march. Just that gray, endless plain of weird plants, and never a sign of any other life. It was so monotonous that I was even glad to see the desert of Xanthus toward the evening of the second day. I was fair worn out, but Tweel seemed as fresh as ever, for all I never saw him drink or eat. I think he could have crossed the Mare Cronium in a couple of hours with those block-long nosedives of his, but he stuck along with me. I offered him some water once or twice. He took the cup from me and sucked the liquid into his beak, and then carefully squirted it all back into the cup and gravely returned it. Just as we sighted Xanthus, or the cliffs that bounded it, one of those nasty sand clouds blew along. Not as bad as the one we had here, but mean to travel against. I pulled the transparent flap of my thermoskin bag across my face and managed pretty well, and I noticed that Tweel used some feathery appendages growing like a mustache at the base of his beak to cover his nostrils, and some similar fuzz to shield his eyes. "He is a desert creature," ejaculated the little biologist Leroy. "Huh? Why?" "He drink no water. He is adapt for sandstorm. Proves nothing. There's not enough water to waste anywhere on this desiccated pill called Mars. We'd call all of it desert on Earth, you know." He paused. "Anyway, after the sandstorm blew over, a little wind kept blowing in our faces, not strong enough to stir the sand. But suddenly things came drifting along from the Xanthus cliffs, small transparent spheres, for all the world like glass tennis balls. But light. They were almost light enough to float even in this thin air. Empty, too. At least I cracked open a couple and nothing came out but a bad smell. I asked Tweel about them, but all he said was, no, 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 which I took to mean that he knew nothing about them. So they went bouncing by like tumbleweeds, or like soap bubbles, and we plugged on toward Xanthus. Tweel pointed at one of the crystal balls once and said, "Rock," but I was too tired to argue with him. Later I discovered what he meant. We came to the bottom of the Xanthus cliffs finally, when there wasn't much daylight left. I decided to sleep on the plateau if possible. Anything dangerous, I reasoned, would be more likely to prowl through the vegetation of the Mare Cronium than the sand of Xanthus. Not that I'd seen a single sign of menace, except the rope-armed black thing that had trapped Tweel, and apparently that didn't prowl at all, but lured its victims within reach. It couldn't lure me while I slept, especially as Tweel didn't seem to sleep at all, but simply sat patiently around all night. I wondered how the creature had managed to trap Tweel, but there wasn't any way of asking him. I found that out too, later. It's devilish. However, we were ambling around the base of the Xanthus barrier looking for an easy spot to climb. At least I was. Tweel could have leaped it easily, for the cliffs were lower than Thiel, perhaps 60 feet. I found a place and started up, swearing at the water tank strapped to my back. It didn't bother me except when climbing, and suddenly I heard a sound that I thought I recognized. You know how deceptive sounds are in this thin air. A shot sounds like the pop of a cork. But this sound was the drone of a rocket, And sure enough, there went our second auxiliary, about 10 miles to westward, between me and the sunset. "Was me," said Putz. "I hunt for you." Yeah, I knew that, but what good did it do me? I hung onto the cliff and yelled and waved with one hand. Tweel saw it too, and set up a trilling and twittering, leaping to the top of the barrier and then high into the air. And while I watched, the machine droned on into the shadows to the south. I scrambled to the top of the cliff. Tweel was still pointing and trilling excitedly, shooting up toward the sky and coming down head-on to stick upside down on his beak in the sand. I pointed toward the south and at myself, and he said, "Yes, yes, yes." But somehow I gathered that he thought the flying thing was a relative of mine, probably a parent. Perhaps I did his intellect an injustice. I think now that I did. I was bitterly disappointed by the failure to attract attention. I pulled out my thermoskin bag and crawled into it, as the night chill was already apparent. Tweel stuck his beak into the sand and drew up his legs and arms and looked for all the world like one of those leafless shrubs out there. I think he stayed that way all night. "Protective mimicry," ejaculated Leroy. "See? He is desert creature." "In the morning," resumed Jarvis, "we started off again. We hadn't gone 100 yards into Xanthus when I saw something queer. This is one thing Putz didn't photograph, I'll wager." There was a line of little pyramids, tiny ones, not more than 6 inches high, stretching across Xanthus as far as I could see. Little buildings made of pygmy bricks, they were. Hollow inside and truncated, or at least broken at the top, and empty. I pointed at them and said, "What?" to Tweel, but he gave some negative twitters to indicate, I suppose, that he didn't know. So off we went, following the row of pyramids because they ran north, and I was going north. Man, we trailed that line for hours. After a while, I noticed another queer thing. They were getting larger. Same number of bricks in each one, but the bricks were larger. By noon they were shoulder high. I looked into a couple, all just the same, broken at the top and empty. I examined a brick or two as well. They were silica, and old as creation itself. "How you know?" asked Leroy. "They were weathered, edges rounded. Silica doesn't weather easily even on Earth and in this climate." "How old you think?" 50,000, 100,000 years. How can I tell? The little ones we saw in the morning were older, perhaps 10 times as old, crumbling. How old would that make them? 500,000 years? Who knows? Jarvis paused a moment. "Well," he resumed, "we followed the line." Tweel pointed at them and said, "Rock," once or twice, but he'd done that many times before. Besides, he was more or less right about these. I tried questioning him. I pointed at a pyramid and asked, "People?" and indicated the two of us. He set up a negative sort of clucking and said, "No, no, no, no 112, no 224, meanwhile rubbing his stomach. I just stared at him and he went through the business again. "No 112, no 224. I just gaped at him. "That proves it," exclaimed Harrison. "Nuts!" "You think so?" queried Jarvis sardonically. "Well, I figured it out different. No 112. You don't get it, of course, do you?" "Nope, nor do you." "I think I do." Tweel was using the few English words he knew to put over a very complex idea. "What, let me ask, does mathematics make you think of?" "Why, of astronomy, or logic." "That's it. No 112. Tweel was telling me that the builders of the pyramids weren't people, or that they weren't intelligent, that they weren't reasoning creatures. Get it?" "Huh, I'll be damned." "You probably will." "Why?" put in Leroy. "He rub his belly?" "Why? Because, my dear biologist, that's where his brains are. Not in his tiny head, in his middle." "C'est impossible." "Not on Mars, it isn't. This flora and fauna aren't earthly. Your biopods prove that." Jarvis grinned and took up his narrative. "Anyway, we plugged along across Xanthus, and in about the middle of the afternoon something else queer happened. The pyramids ended."
This concludes the first part of 2 total of A Martian Odyssey by Stanley G. Weinbaum, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.